Hello and welcome. My name is James Pawelski. I'm professor of practice and director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Humanities and Human Flourishing Project explores connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being. I'm delighted to be talking today with Bro Adams. Bro was the 10th chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities from 2014 to 2017. Bro, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Bro, I wonder if we could start on a personal level with the arts and humanities. Is there an occasion that you can remember and tell us about when there was a connection between your experience in the arts and humanities and your own well-being?
Absolutely. I left college when I was 18 after a pretty bad first year, and I joined the U.S. Army. This was in 1966. 2 years later, I was in Vietnam. I spent a year there as a combat infantry advisor in the Mekong Delta. And I came back in the summer of 1969, a time when the country was literally blowing up because of the war. And I went back to school. I went back to the same place I'd been before, Colorado College. And I had the great fortune there to meet a prominent philosopher in the philosophy department, which became my major, partly because of him. His name was J. Glenn Gray, and he was himself a World War II veteran, and he'd written an extraordinary book on his experiences called The Warriors. And it was one of the first things I read when I got back and got re-engaged in college life. And it changed my life because it gave me a way of situating and understanding my own experience. The book was very much a reflective work on his experiences in combat, and it helped me come to terms with my own. And I think that really shaped the way in which I understood not just philosophy, but later on throughout the rest of my life, the humanities. So it was a charged and powerful first experience, and it really shaped me in the way I think about well-being and the arts and the humanities. So that experience stayed with me.
So the arts and humanities are one way in which we are shaped, in which we find our identity, in which we come to understand more about who we are and how we fit into our society and our culture. You have then gone on to be involved, obviously very deeply in the arts and humanities and trying to advocate for the importance of these domains in our society. Can you tell us more about why you have engaged in this advocacy work?
Well, it's very close to my heart, and it's very close, as I indicated, to my own experience. But I think increasingly with a lot of other people, I've become very, very worried about the marginalization to some degree of the arts and the humanities, particularly in the educational sphere. And it seemed to me more and more important as I went through my own career and then finally had the wonderful opportunity to go to NEH to find ways of making the public case for the humanities because of its power, as you say, precisely, not just around issues of personal identity and personal meaning, though they're very important and powerful there, but I think they have a huge amount to do with our national identity, with our sense of well-being as a people, as a political community, and as a community within the broad community of the world. So they give us forms of knowledge and understanding which we must have, which we need to have, both to live strong, confident, productive lives as individuals, but also very much as members of a political community as well.
But if you're really serious about your career, about making ends meet, you really kind of need to stay away from that. It sounds like your position, your perspective is very different from that.
It is, both with respect to preparation for careers and work life and with respect to the broader purposes of education. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing a narrowing of the aperture of the way people think about the purpose of education and educational institutions, and we've let go of this idea that we need to be educating the whole human being for a whole variety of things across the broad sweep of one's life. And that narrowing has, I think, narrowed the public sense of the value of the humanities. And it's a mistake both with respect to the broader purposes of education, but even with respect to preparation for careers and work life. I think we tend to overestimate the value of the technical disciplines with respect to success in working life, and I think we underestimate the value of the humanities with respect to how well it prepares people to be productive in the economy. So there's a lot to say about how the humanities serve careers, but there's a lot to say about how it serves other dimensions of life that are just as important. Our engagement with one another as citizens, and our engagement in communities, in families, in friendships, in all the places that we end up spending most of our time as adults. So it's very relevant to working life and the economy, but it's relevant to broader domains of life as well.
So how do you think we can make sure that the focus on arts and humanities and, as you were talking about, this personal direction and fulfillment, but also the larger communal health and connection can be maintained in the face of other kinds of values, other kinds of uses of the arts and humanities? So you think about, for example, the music industry, or the movie industry, or the publishing industry. And when you think about an industry, that brings with it certain values that may be consonant with or may not be consonant with the kinds of things you were talking about with respect to arts and humanities in our personal lives and in our collective lives.
The political theorist Danielle Allen has a nice sort of way of talking about this. She talks about education as being invested in three domains of preparation. Preparation for work, which she calls work readiness. Preparation for politics, which she calls participation readiness. And something a little bit more obscure but very real and important, which she calls existential readiness. Readiness for the rest of the demands and challenges that one faces in living a life. I think we need to be more articulate and more compelling and persuasive with regard to the arts and humanities in all of those domains. How do they give us strengths and capabilities and powers that are relevant to working life? How do they prepare us to be engaged citizens? And how do they prepare us for those other personal or collective domains that we spend a huge amount of time in when we're not at work, when we're not working in politics? That's a lot of life. So developing new and more compelling arguments about the utility, I'm not afraid to use that word, the utility of the arts and humanities is really job one for us now, and it's why I feel so strongly about the importance of this project.
So let's talk about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. So as we've discussed, a large emphasis, a large focus on the project is to look at the effects of engagement in arts and humanities, particularly the effects that contribute to well-being on the personal level, on the community level, on the social level. So how does this tie in, thinking about the well-being effects of arts and humanities in this context?
I think well-being is one very important way to speak about the effects of the arts and humanities, not just for personal well-being, though I think it's enormously important there, but the well-being of communities. And of course, you really can't separate those two things because none of us spend our lives alone. We're always living in institutions, we're always living in communities, we're always living in towns, we work in organizations, most of us, with other people. So the personal and the collective, or the personal and the social, are densely and always connected. And the humanities and the arts speak to those connections, I think, in very important ways. Take our democracy and the challenges we have as citizens to preserve a powerful democratic political culture and institutions. You can't do that, and you can't be deeply engaged in a thoughtful way without understanding something about the history of American democratic life, without understanding something about the principles of American democratic thought, and without understanding something about the culture of the country in which we live that presents both the challenges and opportunities to our democracy. In all of those ways, the arts and humanities equip us to be better citizens, to be better members of the polity that we have and that we occupy and that we have to protect. So it's hugely important in that very expansive sense of social and collective life. But I think it also plays a role in the ways we participate in our communities, in the ways we live in our families and in our friendships. And it gives us capacities, and I would even go so far as to say insight, into what it means to live in those settings and to live with other people and to flourish in those settings. So my interest is really in the way in which, in Danielle Allen's good phrase, we are made ready for all of these domains of life by the insights we derive from engaging in the arts and the humanities. And that's why they're so important.
So when we think about what it is that allows large groups of people to live together in pretty small spaces many times, and think about that not just today, but over the course of human history around the world, the arts and humanities play an enormous role in shaping the culture that allows that to happen. And we seem to be experiencing particular tensions in that culture these days, fragmentations, polarizations, the fraying of the social fabric. Do you think that there's a way, if we can, well, so maybe what we need to do is to think about how to evolve culture, how the arts and humanities can rise to help us meet this challenge in new ways. Do you think that this focus on well-being as something that is important for everyone? It doesn't matter where you're at on the political spectrum. It doesn't matter where you're at on the socioeconomic spectrum. Well-being, close connections with others, a sense of meaning and purpose, gratitude for the things that you are enjoying in your life, all of these things are important. Could that be part of what can help us to reweave the social fabric?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great virtues of American life and society is its enormously complex diversity. And that diversity is growing all of the time. It's a wonderful attribute of this country, but it's also something which, especially right now, is growing increasingly difficult for us. And that is one place and way in which the humanities and the arts speak to who we are and what we can be. We can't surmount these difficulties, these challenges we're facing around these questions of diversity without understanding those cultural differences, without becoming better equipped to understand them and to exercise that understanding as we go through our daily lives. So that's one very, very important way in which culture is front and center in our lives right now. And it's not an easy thing. And it's obviously a place where we're severely challenged right now. But without understanding those cultural differences, without understanding the values that are embedded in those differences, we're not going to be able to cope with them. So that's why it worries me so much that the humanities and the arts are being marginalized in educational settings, because it's the only path to really understanding who we are as a people. Another hugely important and related example of this is the history of race relations in this country, which is still so explosive and so powerful in time present. And again, that's a place where if you don't understand the history of race relations and where people have been, you have no chance of understanding or dealing with them now. And so that particular kind of history, that particular sort of understanding of where people have come from is really the key to being able to deal with the tensions in race relations that we're going through now. So that's another great example of how a flourishing community, a community in a state of well-being, has to have these ways of gaining insight into itself.
I really like what you're talking about in terms of understanding. Oftentimes I think we see folks from another group and we think they're different. We don't understand them. And it's easy then, or all too easy, to fall into perspectives that they're wrong or less legitimate in some way than we are. But that process, instead of understanding the history, trying to understand their perspectives and their vantage points and their interests, is such an important part of, again, reweaving that social fabric. And I agree, the arts and humanities can play an enormously important role there. Finally, I just want to ask you about the future moving forward as we think about the diversity that you mentioned, as we think about the resources that we have for appreciating, respecting, and then also trying to understand as best we can each other. How do you see arts and humanities and this well-being frame as being a potential way forward as we continue our history?
Well, we've got to get it right, first of all, in education. I mean, there's no hope of addressing these issues or of really the sense of communal flourishing unless we get the educational process right. And we can't do that if we keep throwing out this notion that we're educating people for broad, complicated, diverse lives. We're not just educating people for the economy. That's very important, and we have to do that, and we have to do that well. Frankly, we are doing that pretty well. I mean, there are complaints about that as well, but that's being done, but we can't forget that we have to do these other things. So the political education of citizens is there, and the education of people for this complex social world that we live in, which is not just complex in its domestic frame, it's also very complicated in the global dimension, where all of us in some sense live. A lot of people are trying to push that away and say, oh no, we don't really live there, but we do live there. And we're living there more and more and more. So we have to get the educational program right, and we have to remember that we're educating whole people for whole lives. And beyond that, I think the arts and the humanities have enormously important public roles beyond the educational system. I mean, look at the scope of the humanities and arts infrastructure in this country. The theater, the museums, the libraries, the performance art, the musical arts. It's a big part of the world. And I think amplifying the ways in which people engage with those institutions, which can be very helpful in addressing these challenges, but also making life richer and more meaningful and fuller. We have to keep investing in those cultural institutions and practices. And we have to expand the opportunities that people have to find themselves in those places. So that presents a major educational agenda and a major cultural agenda. And the government has to be there, and it is there in some ways with the national endowments. State governments need to be there, local communities need to be there. But individuals need to be there, and corporations need to be there, and organizations of all kinds need to be there. Because without that sort of multifaceted commitment, we won't have the resources and we won't have the engagement that we have to make these things come alive.
Well, thank you so much, Bro, for talking with us today. Thank you for the work that you have been doing for many years to advocate for the arts and humanities and their importance in these various levels in our society. And thank you for your partnership in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project.
Thank you.
We really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's great to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for joining us with our discussion with Bro Adams. And we look forward to seeing you next time as we continue these conversations about the connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being.